Drive-in theaters are a classic example of Americana. Today, they are romanticized in popular media by nostalgic images of the flashy, fin-wearing cars of the 1950s and 60s, soda fountains, and sweethearts on their first date. Yet, their downfall in the 1980s seemed to happen overnight, only leaving the eerie remains of mammoth, decaying screens behind. But why? Stay tuned to find out, as today we discover the history of America's lost drive-in theaters. I'm your host, Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Throughout the 20th century, America fell in love with cinema. However, enjoying a movie in the privacy of one's own home was an unthinkable luxury, mostly reserved for the elite. Home theaters, also known as home cinemas or theater rooms, debuted in the United States in 1923. This is around the time that film and car enthusiast Richard Milton Hollingshead Jr. envisioned a stepping stone in the evolution. He considered the highly unusual notion of people watching movies, but in their cars. Now, the fact that this business concept revolved around automobiles was not a coincidence. You see, Richard's father had founded the Whiz Auto Products Company in the early 20th century, trading automobile accessories, greases, and oils. Hence, for weeks, he experimented with a rudimentary outdoor theater concept using a basic Kodak projector and a screen nailed onto his backyard trees. The biggest challenge was the parking arrangement, as bigger cars would obstruct the views of smaller ones. So, using blocks to elevate the vehicles in a simulation of height differences, he finally discovered the right layout, presenting his concept in 1932, alluding to the public that his new invention relates to a new and useful outdoor theater, whereby the transportation facility to and from the theater are made to constitute an element of the seating facility. Then, as an exciting novelty, in 1933, a British comedy, Wives Beware, was screened to viewers watching in a parking lot just outside of Camden, New Jersey. Drivers paid 25 cents per car, plus an additional 25 cents per person in attendance. The screening made waves in the media, with the local Courier Post hailing the event as, quote, the first automobile movie theater in the world. Now, it should be pointed out here that there are others who claim to have invented the drive-in movie theater. For example, there was a partial drive-in theater in Las Cruces, New Mexico since 1915, and they proclaimed, quote, 700 people may be comfortably seated in the auditorium. There are automobile entrances and parking spaces for 40 or more cars within the theater grounds, and inline seating to see the pictures and witness all performances on the stage are features of the place that will please car owners. Also, in 1921, a drive-in was opened in Texas, and cars were said to have been parked bumper to bumper for screenings of silent films. However, we need to point out that there was a distinction. You see, these were just essentially outdoor auditoriums where drivers could technically watch a movie from the parking lot. This novelty created buzz, but the concept was still well ahead of its time. Only some people had cars, and cinema was a medium that was rather associated with the dignity of a theater. And so this phenomenon would take decades to spread, but when it finally did, it caught on like wildfire. The 1950s was the decade of the drive-in movie theater, with 4,000 screens showing pictures across the nation. You see, America was in a post-war boom. Cars were accessible to everyone, and urban sprawl meant that new communities needed entertainment venues. Furthermore, setting up a drive-in theater was straightforward, compared to the property commitment required for a proper movie theater. And there was at least one more strong selling point. A car was a confined environment, so if your party happened to be loud, it would not detract from other theatergoers' experience. This was a critical selling point. Remember, the 50s were the decade of the baby boomers, and more often than not, young people had families of their own. Young kids meant lots of noise, an obstacle that might prove challenging in a shared space. Hollingshead actually recognized this fact way back in the 1930s, and it was one of his key components, recalling, quote, here, the whole family is welcome, regardless of how noisy the children are apt to be. Parents could bring their children to the theater, oftentimes in pajamas, without worrying about bothering other moviegoers. They could also spend time together without paying the expenses of a babysitter. Drive-ins catered to their known audience. offering luxuries such as bottle warmers and diaper vending machines, and later miniature golf courses, swimming pools, and even motels on the land with windows facing the screens so that viewers could watch from the comfort of their beds. This invention, the drive-in, was a stroke of genius. Imagine a giant outdoor screen flanked by rows of parked cars, their headlights off and engines purring. The early facilities had speakers mounted to towers, but by the 1950s, patrons could tune their car radios to a specific station to hear the movie. To accomplish this, each drive-in had its own low-power FM radio transmitter, oftentimes located atop the projection building at the rear of the facility. The drive-in was also ideal for a first date. Unlike indoor cinema theaters, there was an air of informality, if you know what I mean. Or, if you don't know what I mean, let me explain. During the 1950s, the greater privacy afforded to patrons gave drive-ins a reputation as immoral, and they were labeled as, quote, passion pits in the media. Or as you might better recall from the 1978 movie Grease, drive-ins were presented as preferred spots for rendezvous between lovers and cheaters. This behavior was a part of the day's pop culture, but young people took things a few steps further. As the 1950s turned into the 1960s, young people were allowed, if not encouraged, to express their freedom. This behavior was part of the day's pop culture, but young people took things a few steps further. They were meeting up at drive-ins not only for sex, but to smoke marijuana and drink alcohol. As far as public perception was concerned, the drive-in theater crowd transitioned from family-friendly to outright degenerate. In the 1960s, the drive-in was reaching its prime. Marketing schemes to further boost attendance included stunts like small airplane runways, hot air balloon rides, caged monkeys, and personal appearances by actors. Pricing was also set to a flat per-car rate, $1 on weekdays and $5 on the weekend. And here is where things turned south. Drive-ins survived the transformation from family-friendly destinations to essentially becoming party encampments. By making this trade, the venues also gambled their long-term sustainability by exchanging the client type. Indeed, families with kids won't really come in during the school week. Still, they'll return for years, pay per person, and entertain your high-margin product offerings. Whereas the party animal class of customers were effectively tricked into visiting when you offered a shiny object. And if you wanted them to return, you need to invest in another new gimmick. And as you can imagine, the gimmicks have to get larger and larger, so it's unsustainable. Not to mention, they arrived in an overloaded car to get as many patrons into the theater as possible, as they simply paid a flat fee per car, and they also brought their refreshments with them. In other words, they were not very lucrative customers. Then, in the 1970s, America experienced an energy crisis that led to the widespread adaptation of daylight savings time. This meant drive-in theaters had to start an hour later, and since they only earned revenue when it was dark out, many of them could not hold on. In a desperate measure, some theaters leaned much further towards their naughty side, screening adult films during late-night slots, and in some cases, they would go as far as showing illegal content, creating havoc with the authorities in the process. At this point, even Hollywood was sketched out by the smut that had become the drive-in theater venue and elected to pull their most important titles from the roster to avoid a bad association. Opportunistic movie theaters took advantage of this and began offering an incredibly high-fidelity viewing experience. And then finally, when home entertainment became commonplace, people could enjoy the luxury of watching films at home, from full-color broadcast to video rental. Furthermore, the runaway inflation of the late 1970s and early 1980s made the large tracts of land used by drive-ins increasingly expensive and far too valuable for continued use in such a capacity. The revenue essentially disappeared overnight. What had been a wholesome idea was now bankrupt and disgraced. The drive-in theater, it was going away. By the late 1980s, the total number of North American drive-ins fell to under 1,000. They continued their decline for the next few decades, with aging infrastructure and owners unable to afford any improvement to their properties. However, many former drive-in movie sites remain, with several repurposed as storage or flea market sites. Additionally, other residential housing or high-value uses came to rural or sparsely populated areas, and when they did, drive-in theaters were frequently one of the first areas to be redeveloped. For example, in Michigan, former drive-in properties have become industrial parks, shopping centers, indoor theaters, and churches. Such was the case with the former Woodland Drive-In in Grand Rapids, Michigan. In Philadelphia, the South City Drive-In became the location of the original Spectrum in the late 1960s, with a small portion of its old property line extending into what would become the now demolished Veterans Stadium complex. Today, the small portion, combined with the original Spectrum location, is part of Xfinity Live, Philadelphia. Another example of a drive-in turned flea market is Spotlight 88 in North Sewickley Township, Pennsylvania, which ended business as a drive-in after an F3 tornado destroyed much of the property on May 31st, 1985. As a joke, the owners put up the now showing sign with "Gone with the Wind" after the tornado hit. In the end, the screen was rebuilt, but the business never really recovered. By 1989, it was sold and is now the site of a Kroger grocery store. And believe it or not, this was not the only incident of its type. In 1996, a powerful storm tore through a Canadian drive-in, with some witnesses recalling the screen flying away during a showing of the movie Twister. However, the legitimacy of this story has been highly debated. This industry was doomed from the start. Drive-ins require a large amount of land near a population center and can only operate at night during good summer weather. The margins are low, and bad weather can destroy a season. Despite these challenges, Americans have a soft spot for drive-ins, and since the 2000s, the venues have experienced a cult-like revival. The release of LCD projectors and micro radio transmitters in 2001 allowed for boutique drive-ins. The first of its type was the Liberation Drive-In in Oakland, California, which sought to reclaim underused urban spaces such as vacant parking lots in the downtown area. The years to follow have enjoyed the rise of the so-called guerrilla drive-in movement, in which groups of dedicated individuals orchestrate similar outdoor film and video screenings. Showings are often organized online, and participants meet at specific locations to watch films projected on bridge pillars or warehouses. The content featured at these screenings has frequently been independent or experimental films, cult movies, or alternative programming. And then there was another breakthrough in 2014, when retro-themed burger chain Johnny Rockets announced it would team up with drive-ins to open 200 locations by 2018. And this move may have paid off. You see, during the COVID-19 pandemic, drive-in theaters reported an unexpected surge in attendance in several U.S. states. This is because, unlike indoor theaters, which could not operate with the bans on mass gatherings, drive-ins were allowed to operate with events like graduations because people were automatically separated from each other by their cars, which is slightly ironic when you consider that the original sales pitch back in the 1930s was for families to enjoy a movie in separation from other families. By 2020, only 549 drive-in theaters remain. As for the other 3,500 that once entertained America, they're now abandoned or covered entirely by different structures and simply fading away in the elements. Special thanks to our channel members for making this episode possible. If you'd like to support the channel, please click the join button to learn more. Otherwise, I thank you all for subscribing, and until next time, I'm Ryan Sokash, signing off.